Welcome back to another episode of Sabbath School Boot Camp. My name is Matthew Lucio. My job is to help you get the most out of your class. Today we're going to be looking at lesson number 2 of the Adult Bible Study Guide. It's called The Central Issue, Love or Selfishness. Now last week we talked about the scriptural foundations for the great controversy. This week we're going to focus on the principle that is at stake in the great controversy. What does it all boil down to? So grab your Bibles and your study guide because Sabbath School Boot Camp starts now. All right, let's go on to Sunday. Ty Gibson always says that the deepest human desire is to love and be loved. And I want to agree with that statement, but as the lesson points out, Jesus showed people the purest, most constant love anyone could ever experience, and they still killed him. Now, love may be our deepest human need, but is it our deepest human desire? Isn't the whole premise of sin in the Garden of Eden that I would rather be free than be loved? The serpent didn't promise Adam and Eve more love, but freedom and wisdom and a chance to be like God. If love were every human's deepest desire, wouldn't we have rushed to embrace Jesus? Now, the lesson wants us to focus on the destruction of Jerusalem as the work of Satan, but I think the better example of this is closer at hand, the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, this controversy over whether or not God is who he says he is, right? Like that's the central issue. Is God who he says he is? Is he really love? Is he really good? Is he really kind? And the devil says that God is a liar, that he really isn't kind and loving, that God covets power and he lies and he'll kill to protect it just like everybody else you know. And truly, how would we humans know what God is truly like? I mean, he could be saying all the right things, and it's not like we can read his text messages to see what he's writing behind our backs. We can't run a background check on God. God could be up there, just messing with us, just pretending to be love and laughing at us as we fall for his tricks, right? Like, how could we really know what God is like? How can we really be sure as human beings? And conversely, how do we really know what Satan is like? And I think the only answer to that question is to look at the cross. No selfish God would voluntarily come down here in human form and then consent to be killed on the cross for our sake. No truly selfish being would risk his life on this charade, not when he has infinite power over us. Likewise, no matter what the devil says about himself, oh, I'm just misunderstood or whatever, we see who he is at the cross too. The cross is all we need to see to know who is loving and who is selfish. All right, let's move on over to Monday. On Monday, the point is that because Jesus warned his followers about the destruction of Jerusalem in places like Luke 19, Matthew 23, ahead of time, then none of them were caught off guard when the Romans came knocking about 40 years later. The lesson mentions that Christians fled to a place called Pella in modern-day Jordan. Admittedly, this is something we learn from two early church historians, Eusebius and Epiphanius. I think I'm going to get that. Epiphanius. There we go. Eusebius and Epiphanius, two early church historians. And they're writing like 300 years after the fact. Both of these historians say that some supernatural event warned the Christians to flee to Pella. We just don't know for sure what really happened to the Christians in Jerusalem in 70 AD. But it does seem probable that Eusebius and Epiphanius, I'm going to get that right by the time. Good luck if you're teaching this lesson. You want to use this anecdote. Anyways, I guess it is unlikely that Eusebius and Epiphanius concocted this story out of thin air, right? It's probably based on some truth that Christians fled Jerusalem and were given some kind of sign or something, right? Certainly. But the lesson's point is that this is an example of how God looks out for his people. And I don't know that this is a great example of God's providence simply because we don't really have any reliable historical accounts. But that's besides the point. As the lesson wants to reassure us that God's overall care for us, and that the great controversy between the devil and Jesus is very much a war, the war behind all other wars on this planet. The lesson points us to Revelation chapter 2 in verse 10, where John tells us, right, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, Now, I'm sure the devil did not personally come down and arrest these Christians. No, John meant that the devil would work through some human power. And while humans have free will, we are meant to understand that this cosmic conflict in heaven has spilled out into the earth. Both God and the devil are influencing people to do things on this planet. We're also meant to be reassured of two difficult things. First, that God is sovereign. Second, that God cares. God's sovereignty means that he has ultimate authority over what happens in the universe. God's love means that he uses that sovereignty for the good of all. So even though we face sorrow and catastrophe in this war, as soldiers do in all wars, we know that it will all work out because God will work it all out for good. I love that line in Hebrews 11, and after describing all that God's people has suffered, that line says, "The world was not worthy of them." And I think that's just an absolutely beautiful thought. Okay, moving on to Tuesday. As we've noted here, the consequence of being in this war is that there are casualties. The lesson reminds us that Jesus' disciples faced threats, imprisonment, persecution, death, and we often pray for God to spare us from having to go through any kind of difficulty. And that's natural, isn't it? Who wants to be in a war? We would all rather just have peace and quiet. But we don't get to choose whether we are a part of this cosmic conflict or not. Remember that scene in Lord of the Rings where Frodo says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." And Gandalf, this kind of wise figure in the story, says, "So do I. And so do all who live to see such times," right? It's natural not to want to go through this stuff. But Gandalf tells him, that is not for them to decide. You don't get to decide whether or not you have to rise to the occasion, whether or not you're a part of this war. You just have to decide, as Gandalf says, what to do with the time that is given us. In other words, we don't get to say, hold on, time out, I never has to be part of this cosmic conflict. That's an Adam and Eve thing, not a me thing. We don't get that choice. And we can whine about the fact that we don't have that choice all we want, but it doesn't change the fact that we're here and there are spiritual bullets flying over our head. So we just need to accept reality that this is, my lesson just fell, for crying out loud. Anyways, we don't get to decide whether we're part of this war. We just have to accept the reality that we're here and to decide, what are we going to do with it? Now that we're here, what are we going to do? Are we going to fight? Are we going to surrender? What side are we going to be on? Like, those are really the only choices we get. We don't get the choice of whether or not we want to be a part of this. And so we might wish we were born somewhere else outside of this war. It's just not a choice we can make. We are here. We're in the mud. We have to choose which side we're going to join. There's no Switzerland. There's no neutrality. We are either on the side of our Creator or of the rebel. Now, we see the cost of joining the Creator. The rebel will throw us in jail and make our lives harder. But what we also see in the book of Acts is an incredible and irrepressible joy. These disciples went through all of this, and they didn't give up. They had courage and a deep sense of purpose. Hebrews 12 tells us that Jesus endured the cross because of the joy that was set before him. The joy of seeing humans redeemed in a world made new. And that joy apparently made the struggle worth it for him. Every one of us has to answer the question, is the struggle worth it? What am I fighting for? Do I have my eyes on the outcome? Are we following God out of a sense of joy? On Wednesday, we're going to talk about how we care for each other in the church. If we are on God's side of the cosmic conflict and God's side is the side of selflessness, then that should impact the way that we treat one another. We see this in the church in Acts. Acts 2 offers that iconic picture in 3 parts. First, we see that believers with property sold it to help fellow believers in need. Second, they continued to meet together in the temple, presumably for worship. Third, believers hosted each other in their homes for meals, and they enjoyed each other's company. Now, we could boil this down and say the early church was characterized by these 3 characteristics: a sense of justice, worship, and fellowship. Now, this is a kind of new world being born out of the old. Let me just say a word about this word justice, because I think that may be the one word of the three that people are going to, I guess, pause with. What do we mean by that? And I simply mean a setting right of what is wrong in the world. This is confirmed in Acts 3 when we see Peter tell a disabled person that he doesn't have silver and gold, right? Like, I don't have money to give you, but I do have Jesus, and in Jesus' name, get up and walk. Aside from justice, worship, and fellowship, the church had Jesus in their midst, and that's really what they were offering the world. And so, like, when you're talking about this person in Acts 3 with Peter, like, what is the justice here? We see Jesus doing these kinds of healings too, right? The justice is that in God's reality, if we had never sinned, we would never have persons who are unable to walk. We would never have blind persons. We would never have people wrestling with this. And so part of being in Jesus' kingdom is we're fixing that. We're setting it right. We're putting things the way that they should be. That is justice. Jesus is in the midst of the church doing that Jesus thing and repairing the world around him through the church. Now in Acts 6, we see the first cracks in the church. The Greek-speaking believers felt neglected in the daily distribution of food for those who needed it. In this justice work that the church was doing, some felt neglected. And that's because, well, I guess this ministry of justice did not include them, and so it became an injustice to them. And it raises a question: are the Hebrew-speaking believers first-class citizens? Is Christianity fundamentally a Jewish faith, or is it a global faith? The church wasn't neglecting the Greek-speaking believers intentionally. Not everything we do, not every injustice we commit is intentional. The problem was the church just wasn't organized to reach these Greek-speaking believers. Maybe it began with just a few people who volunteered to go to a few homes with food, but now they were being asked to expand that operation, and that required reorganization of the church. In other words, the church reorganized for a greater mission out of a sense of justice. The organization of the church is not sacred. It exists to accomplish this mission. So church should be constantly optimizing. And by church, I guess in our modern context, it could be a local church, could be a small church, a big church, could be the denomination itself. We should be constantly optimizing for mission by reforming itself whenever necessary. And neither is organization, by the way. The source of mission, the source of everything the church does is the gospel. Justice, worship, and fellowship are the fruits of the gospel. And this is a reason why communism fails, by the way. It says, great, let's have people sell things, and no one will be in need. And the natural human heart doesn't want to do that. Government coercion is not a strong motivation to do the right thing. The gospel gives the motive power for everything the church does. And the results of that is justice, worship, and fellowship. Let's get to Thursday, talk about how the church is known. In John 13:35, Jesus says that everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And that's a distinguishing mark of being a Christian. Not your mere profession of faith, not the name on the sign outside the building, not the shape of the building. Fundamentally, you are a follower of Jesus if you act like Jesus by loving each other. John makes this very clear in the other text we're asked to look up, 1 John 4:21, where he says that we are given a command to love one another. And I think God put that word command in there just for Adventists, since we love commandments. John's statement is actually more nuanced, I think. If you love God, you must also love your brother and sister. That is, the vertical relationship between God and I must have horizontal implications between you and I. We cannot compartmentalize that vertical relationship in our lives as if it makes no difference how I treat others. This is how we become hypocrites, by the way, as we see it with the Pharisees and with others. Like people who have this vibrant, faith-filled relationship with God, and then it makes no difference in the world around them. Like, this is not how faith is meant to work. If I claim to love God, I must also love you. That is, if we are captured by the gospel, it must lead us towards, we might say, justice, worship, which is something we do together, and fellowship, and again, something we do together. In other words, the gospel must have implications for how we live in this world. Now, the lesson gives us a few historical examples of how this worked. Early Christians helping victims of epidemics and natural disasters when they didn't have to. From our modern world, it's hard to properly appreciate this because this kind of work is often institutionalized today in our hospitals, governments, even non-religious charities. So we might say, so what if Christians helped victims of an epidemic? Everyone does that, today at least. The fact that everyone does that today is, in fact, a testimony to Christianity, because when a plague emerged around 166 AD, the emperor and his doctor, a celebrated famous doctor, fled Rome to wait it out and hide. That was the typical way of handling this. If you could leave, you left. The fact that many Christians stayed behind and risked their lives to alleviate suffering is exactly what led society to focus on, well, how do we treat these diseases? How do we stay in place to help people rather than abandoning them? And then we looked for ways to protect these caregivers, because if people are risking their lives to help plague victims, for instance, or victims of an earthquake or a volcano, how can we protect these caregivers, these predominantly Christians in the early period of the church? And so, this is why today we have aid workers rushing to disaster areas. Like, they're following the example that the earliest Christians set. All right, let's go on to Friday and talk about what we could talk about in our class this week. There's some interesting questions you might raise. For instance, question 1 on Friday, I think, is a very thought-provoking question. We often talk about persecution as if it's always brings out the best in us. We love those stories of someone who defiantly stayed faithful to the end despite persecution. Stories where the church continued to spread despite the pressure. But the lesson asks, I think, a very good question. What about those times when people are persecuted and nothing good seems to come out of it? What about when Christians just suffer and that's it? Which, of course, leads to the larger question. Is suffering always meaningful? Is it ever meaningless? And I think that could be a real deep philosophical question, but it's worth talking about. It's worth talking about. A second question that we could talk about here is this topic of justice, worship, and fellowship. I wouldn't say these are the only fruits of the gospel in the life of the church, but they are the ones highlighted in Acts chapter 2. How is your church doing in each of those areas? That's a conversation you guys could have as well. Jesus said to his disciples that they would be known as his disciples by how they loved each other. That is the love members of the church have for each other. Is that something that is pronounced, marked in your congregation? Worship, of course, is something the church does together as well. And they were having fellowship in each other's homes. They were distributing food, not to the public necessarily, not at first at least, but to fellow members. Of course, that mission expanded later on into public welfare, but there was an important emphasis on making sure the church was this just, worshiping, fellowshipping new society being formed into the world. Acts is not concerned with reforming Rome. It is concerned with making sure that the followers of Jesus are, well, following Jesus. Well, that'll do it for now. Thanks again for watching Sabbath School Boot Camp. I'll see you next week. Class dismissed.